Troy, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on the show. I made the point in my column today in The Australian that our federation's completely fractured under the stress of this pandemic. National cabinets are farce. I mean, it's neither national or collegiate as a cabinet generally is, and we're desperately in need of some real national leadership instead of all this scrapping amongst state leaders. You understand, the machinery of government better than most. What's your assessment about where we are tonight and the bluing that's going on, and how on earth do we get things back on track?
Look, I think you're right, Peter. We are obviously facing one of the greatest crises we've ever had as a nation in terms of the health and economic impact of this pandemic. And so we need to have some kind of national coordinating body. And the National Cabinet, I think, was an important innovation and certainly much better than COAG. But the problem is, as you've identified today, is that the backbiting, the squabbling, the buck passing between jurisdictions, and there hasn't been the national or state-based leadership that I think the nation needs. I think most Australians just want to see hotel quarantine fixed. They want to see the vaccine rollout improved, and they want to see state and federal governments actually working together. But of course, they're not doing that. They're just blaming each other, and particularly the comments by the Queensland government, the Premier and the Chief Medical Officer there, the health officer, about AstraZeneca is diabolical for Australia's vaccine rollout. So here they are blaming the federal government for a lack of vaccines, and that's a legitimate criticism, but they are themselves undermining confidence in AstraZeneca. So it's a mess, and the Australian people are worse off because our governments aren't working together. Instead, they're blaming each other.
I guess the problem now, though, 18 months in, because the Prime Minister's created this beast, he's actually ceded a lot of authority to these state premiers who all have their own constitutions, their own jurisdictional capacity under the Federation to go to Canberra, agree whatever they like, and then thumb their nose as soon as they get home, which is exactly what we've seen this week. So how does the PM wrest back control? I mean, people are going to blame him for this. They're going to look to Canberra to solve this problem. How does he get it back on the rails?
Well, he, of course, has the most at stake, Peter, because not only is he the Prime Minister and he's ultimately responsible, but he's got an election around the corner. We'll be at an election certainly within the next 12 months. So what he has to do, I think, is he initially gave the premiers a lot of latitude, a lot of authority, a lot of responsibility, and he did that because he didn't want to get too much criticism or get caught in argy-bargy disagreements between the states and the Commonwealth. But what we're seeing now is that they haven't respected what he has given to them, which is the authority and the independence in decision-making, and so now they're turning that back on him and blaming him. I think there's a case here for the Prime Minister to step up in terms of much stronger leadership. I think he should be mandating and directing state governments to do certain things rather than letting them just make the decisions. And this vaccine rollout is critical to everything else. So I don't think the Prime Minister helped the situation with his advice on AstraZeneca earlier this week. But I think there is a case for much stronger leadership and telling the states effectively what they've got to do and using the national parliament, if necessary, to make sure they do it.
Yeah, look, he has the whip hand. He is the one that's buying, sourcing, importing every vaccine dose in this country. The deal with AstraZeneca being manufactured in CSL in Melbourne, that comes through the Commonwealth. So the delivery of the vaccines into arms has got a lot of state governments involved, but he's responsible for the doses. He should use that as collateral in sort of, I think, taking back charge and giving people confidence that we'll come through this, because we absolutely have to get vaccinated if we're going to open the doors. We've got to open the doors because the rest of the world has. That's the problem. We haven't had much good news lately, but we've got some good news. You've broken it in the Australia. The National Archives, they've been allocated, they'll get $67 million. And this is emergency funding. This is to save all of those records, war records and others, really critical parts of history that are being stored but are basically falling apart. Give us a sense of how hard this fight's been behind closed doors, Troy.
Yeah, Peter, look, it's been a fascinating case study in, I think, something that just wasn't properly on the government's radar. So the National Archives are our national memory keeper. They hold our national treasures. It's not only wartime cabinet papers, bureaucratic papers, but immigration records, war service records, census data, even ASIO surveillance material, and millions and millions and millions of documents, films, tapes, maps, photos, all sorts of things. And so this is really critical. But the archives are decaying because they have been underfunded by governments for a long time. So there was an independent review done by former senior public servant David Tune, and he recommended urgent funding given to the archives. And he gave that report to the government last year, and the government simply didn't act on it. And in fact, in the budget, they didn't give any additional money to the archives. And so this was a national travesty. And we've had now 150 leading Australian historians sign an open letter to the Prime Minister asking him to urgently provide this funding. And to the government's credit, they have responded to that. And so just yesterday, the ERC met and decided to give this 67 million over 4 years. It was originally suggested it be given over 7 years, but the government's going to speed up delivery of that money, and it will save a lot of our national treasures in the archives, which will make them digital and also make sure they're properly preserved and more accessible to not only researchers but everyday Australians from their computers in their own homes.
Well done, PM. Well done, Josh Frydenberg. Ministers are ultimately responsible for getting this fixed last year, but clearly they have to step in at the leadership level. I think that's very, very good to hear that tonight. I want to go to an issue I touched on in my editorial. I talked about activist academics, and this is this is the curriculum underpinnings. Revealed today that some of the people who are advising the expert body to shape the education curriculum, well, they believe Australia was, quote, founded on white supremacy, and the boomerangs led to the invention of unmanned drones. And they're this very powerful Indigenous group who meets and advises ACARA, curriculum body, on the inclusion of Aboriginal themes in the framework that our children will learn at school. Now, I spoke a little bit before about the Primary English Teaching Association of Australia. This is the teacher's guide, and it's got all this sorts of rubbish that wants to turn kids into little Extinction Rebellion activists. But you've also got this other issue. We're falling, as you know, Troy, down all the league tables around the world in terms of maths and English and everything else. History is almost extinct in terms of its treatment in the curriculum. And yet we've got this terrible activism coming in to ACARA, as opposed to, I think everyone wants a fair treatment of the Aboriginal story in the curriculum today. They don't want the activism.
I think you're right, Peter. Look, I think my starting point on this is I think that we are overall a good country with a history that we can be proud of. Sure, there are lots of things that we got wrong and we can always do things better, but we can't turn back to the past. We must look to the future. And I think our schools do a very good job generally in providing a balanced curriculum. But what this is, and you've uncovered it on the program tonight, Peter, is backdoor political activism. And we're seeing these teachers and these educators trying to indoctrinate the minds of our young kids. But all their job is to give them a good education. And that means a fair and honest representation of our history, the good and the bad, and also making sure that the maths and the science and the English is taught properly as well. And they can take up political activism when they get to university later in life. Let's just focus on giving them a good, solid education, and let's not diminish our country in the process of doing that as well.
Well, you're a writer, mate. This is the primary school English language teacher's manual, all about climate change, nothing about grammar and punctuation. And if you've hired anyone under the age of 30, you know that is in sharp, sharp decline. I just think this is crazy. I think we've got to focus. We are in the most competitive region in the world, in Asia, and the scholastic achievement of kids in this region puts us under pressure. We've got to do better. The date today is very important. You've done an interview with Paul Keating to mark the lift in superannuation today. It's gone up to 10%. It is your wages, Australia, though. It is your wages. It's not someone else's money. What did Paul Keating have to say?
Yeah, Peter, look, it's always good to talk to former Prime Ministers, and Paul Keating's always very entertaining. Of course, he is the architect of Australia's superannuation system, which on balance, the Callaghan Review found last year is good and sustainable. It's a model for around the world. Not only do we have nearly $3 trillion under management in this country, which can be invested in things like infrastructure, we now have a guaranteed dignity and security in retirement for people of all ages and all walks of life. And so that superannuation increase today going to 10% is an achievement, I think, of both Labor and coalition governments. Paul Keating wanted to mark the occasion. He says superannuation is now a community standard, meaning it is now sacrosanct like Medicare, and we should move beyond the wars on superannuation. Now, I think there's still reform to happen that we need in terms of fees and charges and governments changing rules, and also the trade unions, which often use the industry funds as a gravy train. But really, I think, Peter, that's a sideshow, because what today shows is that we've got a good superannuation system in place now. Most people will see their wages increase, not decrease, and it'll give them a better retirement. So this is a model for the rest of the world, and something that we should be as proud of as we are proud of Medicare.
All right, well, I don't want to end on a discordant note, a little bit of difference there between us, but I thank you for your time, Troy Bramston.
Thanks very much, Peter.